The Grand Council Chamber of the Galactic Empire was a spectacle of arrogance and power, an architectural marvel suspended within the void of space, its golden spires glimmering under the light of 1,000 artificial suns. Here, decisions that shaped the fate of the known universe were made, whispered between species who had long since considered themselves the arbiters of civilization. Among them sat the representatives of over 500 interstellar nations, each cloaked in their respective traditions, each carrying the weight of their people's ambitions. And at the heart of it all, standing alone on the central platform, was the man they had all come to see. Alexander Grayson was not a soldier. He was not a warrior, nor a leader of armies. He was a diplomat, a man who had spent decades ensuring that humanity's place among the stars was one of peace, of careful negotiation, of deliberate restraint. He had spoken for Earth in times of crisis, had brokered alliances where war seemed inevitable, had carried the weight of his people's trust with unwavering conviction. And now, they expected him to beg. The Shi'ari Dominion, one of the oldest and most feared empires in the galaxy, had made a grievous miscalculation. Believing humanity weak, believing their political structure fragile, they had orchestrated an attack, not on Earth, not on military installations, but on the very thing that bound Alexander Grayson to his cause. They had murdered his family, his wife, his son, his daughter. It had been a precise, calculated strike, executed in the dead of night, meant to break him, to force humanity into compliance under the weight of grief and fear. The Shi'ari believed they understood war. They believed they understood power. They had no idea what they had done. Grayson stood before the council, his expression unreadable, his posture steady. He was dressed in the formal attire of a Terran ambassador, his navy blue suit pressed to perfection, a single pin on his lapel signifying his authority. His gaze swept across the assembled dignitaries, meeting the curious, mocking, indifferent eyes of creatures who had ruled the stars for millennia. And then, in a voice that carried through the vast chamber with the weight of an unbreakable will, he spoke 7 words that would alter the course of history. "By my authority, I declare total war." The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum. A frozen moment where the universe itself seemed to hesitate, uncertain whether it had heard correctly. Then came the laughter. The Uldrith delegate, a towering reptilian creature with emerald scales and a mouth full of needle-like teeth, let out a harsh, grating chuckle. The insectoid Thronox representative clicked its mandibles in amusement. The Shi'ari themselves did not laugh, but their ambassador, Lord Nzarin, leaned forward with a smug expression, his 4 eyes glinting with condescension. "Human," Nzarin said, his voice thick with amusement. "Do you even comprehend the words you speak? The Terran Confederation has, what, a fleet of a few hundred ships? Perhaps a handful of war-ready stations? You cannot fathom the strength of the Galactic Empire, let alone the Dominion." Grayson did not respond. He simply held the ambassador's gaze, unblinking. "You are outmatched in every way," Nzarin continued, his tone carrying the exaggerated patience of a parent addressing a particularly dim-witted child. "Your technology is primitive. Your strategic reach is non-existent. Even if Earth were to muster every single resource, every last soldier, every last vessel, you would last, what? A month? A week?" Still, Grayson remained silent. "Your threats are meaningless," Nzarin finished, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. "You are alone." Grayson slowly tilted his head, considering the words. Then he reached into his pocket, retrieving a small, silver device, an Earth-standard diplomatic communicator. He lifted it, pressing a single button. "Not alone," he said. The chamber darkened. A holographic transmission flickered to life in the air above him. At first, it was static. Then, as the image resolved, the assembled council members found themselves staring at the face of President Evelyn Hathaway of the United Terran Confederation. She was seated at her desk in the Terran capital, a simple ceramic mug in her hand. Across the mug in bold red letters were the words, "World's Best Overlord." "Hello, council members," she said, her voice carrying the kind of disinterested authority reserved for those who had already made up their minds. You may be wondering why my ambassador just declared total war. Let me clarify. She set down her mug and leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk. Behind her, members of the Terran High Command stood at the ready, generals, admirals, intelligence directors. You see, when the Shi'ari murdered Alexander Grayson's family, they didn't just attack a diplomat, she continued. They attacked an ideal, an entire way of life that humanity has fought to preserve since we first set foot among the stars. And now, we're done pretending to be civilized about it. The holographic feed shifted. A live satellite image of the Terran Navy's orbital command came into view, displaying a staggering number of ships, each marked with the insignia of Earth's finest. More than the Council had believed humanity capable of mustering. Far more. As of this moment, all treaties between the Terran Confederation and the Galactic Empire are null and void, Hathaway stated. Every restriction, every limitation placed upon our military growth, every diplomatic avenue we've been forced to abide by gone. A council member stammered. But you lack the capability. Do we? Hathaway cut in, raising an eyebrow. Because last I checked, we've spent the last 50 years preparing for the worst-case scenario. You just gave us an excuse to use it. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Some delegates were shouting in alarm, others scrambling to contact their homeworlds. The Shi'ari ambassador had gone pale, his previously smug demeanor now replaced with something much closer to panic. Effective immediately, Hathaway continued. Operation Unthinkable is in full effect. And before you ask, no, we will not explain what that entails. The feed cut. The hologram vanished. And for the first time in the history of the Galactic Empire, the rulers of the universe understood the true meaning of fear. Grayson exhaled slowly, pocketing his communicator. He looked up at the assembled council, the weight of his words still settling in their minds. The Uldrith delegate, once so amused, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The Thronox representative's mandibles clicked in uncertainty, not amusement. Inzeran opened his mouth, likely to issue another retort, another attempt at regaining control, but Grayson was already stepping off the platform. As he walked toward the exit, his voice echoed through the chamber one last time. You should have left my family alone. And with that, he was gone. The Shi'ari Dominion had long believed in the infallibility of their empire. They had conquered, subjugated, and ruled without serious opposition for centuries. Their fleets were vast, their armies unchallenged, and their weapons technology among the most advanced in the galaxy. So when the humans declared total war, it was met not with concern, but with amusement. A week had passed since Alexander Grayson's dramatic declaration, and the Shi'ari High Command still found the whole ordeal more of an annoyance than a threat. Lord Inzeran, now overseeing the War Council from the command station orbiting Zurich Prime, was more irritated than worried. The humans had always been an upstart species, loud, unpredictable, and irritatingly resilient. But their reach was limited. Their fleets were laughably small in comparison to the Dominions. Their weapons lacked refinement. Their tactics were crude. He had personally assured the Galactic Empire that this would be no different than the many planetary skirmishes they had handled before. The Dominion had prepared a response fleet of 70 battleships, ready to retaliate against the inevitable human resistance, forces that would scramble in desperation. They would eliminate the Terran Navy in one decisive strike a few minor Earth colonies as a warning, and force the humans back into the role they were best suited for, meek diplomats who understood their place. Then, the first attack came. It was not a grand battle. There was no warning, no announcement, no grand fleet appearing on their sensors. One moment, Zurich Prime's orbital defenses were at full operational strength. The next, their planetary capital had been reduced to a smoldering crater. The attack had come from orbit, but there had been no energy discharges, no missile trails, no signs of an assault in the conventional sense. The Planetary Defense Network, designed to detect high-energy plasma bombardments and shield against photon-based weaponry, had detected nothing. Inzeran barely had time to react before his tactical officers shouted over each other, scrambling to make sense of the disaster. The reports were erratic. Zurich Prime had been hit by kinetic bombardment. The words sent a chill through the command station. No one used kinetic bombardment. It was crude, primitive, and indiscriminate. The Galactic Empire had banned it centuries ago, dismissing it as the weapon of barbarians. Energy weapons were precise, sophisticated, and honorable. Kinetics, by contrast, were brutal in their simplicity. There was no way to intercept them, no shields to block them, no elegant countermeasure to mitigate them. The humans had not sent ships into battle. They had simply dropped several hundred tungsten rods from orbit. The weapons, traveling at terminal velocity, struck Zurich Prime surface with the force of small nuclear explosions, reducing military installations, city centers, and government structures into smoking, glass-lined craters. Lord Inzerin watched the footage in stunned silence. Thousands dead in an instant. His people screaming, panicking. A single human attack, and Zurich Prime's defenses had been obliterated without a single energy blast. Then the second attack came. This time, it was not a silent orbital bombardment. This time, the humans were making themselves known. Inzerin's tactical officer shouted that a fleet had entered the system. Human vessels, dozens of them. Not battleships, not dreadnoughts. Cargo haulers. Civilian-grade haulers, lightly armored, carrying no known heavy weaponry. A trap, Inzerin had thought. The humans were foolish enough to send unarmed ships, hoping for some pathetic diplomatic negotiation. The Shi'ari fleet moved to intercept, their battleships locking onto the slow-moving Terran vessels with ease. Inzerin gave the order to open fire. But before the command could be carried out, every Shi'ari warship's communication systems were hijacked. An audio transmission, broadcasted fleet-wide, filled the command center. It was loud. It was alien. It was incomprehensible. It was music. Blasting, triumphant, deafening human music. It took a few seconds for Inzerin to process the sheer absurdity of what was happening. The bridge speakers were blaring what his translator labeled as Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins. The bass reverberated through the walls. His crew, panicked, tried desperately to shut it off, but the interference had overridden their communications entirely. The music continued, accompanied by human voices shouting across the comms. Guess what, boys? We just went weapons free. Before Inzerin could demand an explanation, the cargo haulers in front of them suddenly detonated. Not ships, not transports, decoys. The explosion that followed blinded every sensor on the Shi'ari fleet. Hundreds of miniature drones erupted from wreckage, each one no larger than a maintenance bot, but armed with enough explosives to cripple warships from the inside. The Shi'ari fleet had no time to react. The drones were inside their defensive perimeters before they could raise their shields. They slipped past every security measure, latching onto ship hulls, venting oxygen, slicing through power relays. The Shi'ari had no answer for this kind of warfare. They fought with tactics, with predictable formations, with well-established strategies that had been refined over centuries. The humans? The humans were fighting like they were in a bar brawl. Chaos erupted. Battleships spiraled out of control, their systems fried, their crews struggling to regain order. One ship accidentally fired upon another. The Thalzur, a Shi'ari destroyer, attempted to retreat but found itself hacked. Its distress signal replaced with human transmissions looping the Wilhelm scream. Inzerin gritted his teeth, trying to make sense of the situation, but every moment brought more reports of unconventional human tactics. They weren't fighting a war. They were causing absolute mayhem. Then, as if to drive the madness further, another human transmission hijacked their screens. It was not a tactical briefing. It was not a demand for surrender. It was a human soldier standing in front of a camera, holding a microphone. Behind him, the silhouette of Earth's fleet loomed. The soldier grinned. Hey there, Shi'ari. Welcome to the galactic equivalent of a curb stomp. We'd like to take this moment to thank you for making this all possible. Special shout out to Lord Inzerin. Big fan, love your work. This next one's dedicated to you. The video cut to footage of massive missile bays opening up. The humans had been stalling. They had been buying time. The real attack was only beginning. The command center erupted into red alarms as dozens of human warships decloaked. Actual warships this time. Heavily armed, reinforced, and already primed to fire. Inzeran turned to his tactical officer. "Get the fleet out of here. Now." The Shi'ari were fast, but not fast enough. The first human salvo hit before the retreat command could be issued. It was brutal, indiscriminate, merciless. The Dominion had expected energy duels, drawn-out engagements, battles fought on the slow, predictable terms of traditional warfare. Instead, the humans had deployed saturation missile fire. Thousands of projectiles, too many to track, too many to intercept, too many to counter. The Shi'ari fleet was shredded. Battleships that had stood for centuries were turned into burning wreckage in mere minutes. Inzeran watched helpless, as his command center burned around him, alarms blaring, his crew screaming. This wasn't war. This was annihilation. The last thing Lord Inzeran saw before the command station was obliterated was a final transmission from the Terran forces. A simple message. Should have left his family alone. And then everything went dark. The destruction of the Shi'ari fleet sent shockwaves throughout the Galactic Empire. Entire civilizations, once indifferent to the conflict, now sat in terrified silence as reports flooded in. The Shi'ari Dominion, a power that had stood unchallenged for centuries, had suffered a defeat so absolute that it defied belief. The wreckage of their mighty warships drifted through space, the remnants of their once proud armada serving as a grim monument to human vengeance. No one had expected this. The humans had not merely retaliated, they had humiliated their enemy. The strategies they employed made no sense to the more civilized species. There was no grand strategy, no drawn-out campaigns of attrition, no slow war of positioning. Instead, humanity fought with overwhelming aggression, with chaotic brilliance, with tactics that shouldn't have worked, but did. The Empire convened an emergency war council. The Emperor himself, a being of immense stature with luminous golden eyes, presided over the meeting. For the first time in centuries, he looked uncertain. Around him, his high advisors whispered in hushed, anxious tones. "This is madness," one of them murmured. "How could they have prepared for this? They shouldn't have been able to deploy such forces so quickly," another hissed. "Their fleet numbers were grossly underestimated." "And their tactics," a third voice interjected, flustered. "There's no honor in how they fight. They refuse to meet us in proper engagements. They refuse to abide by any known convention." "They don't fight for honor," the Emperor finally spoke, his deep voice sending chills through the chamber. "They fight to win." That simple realization sent a ripple of unease through the gathered leaders. The humans did not play by the rules of war as the galaxy understood them. There were no rules to them, only victory, by any means necessary. The Emperor turned to one of his intelligence officers. "Status on Lord Inzeran? Confirmed dead. His command station was vaporized before he could escape." A heavy silence filled the room. Inzeran had been one of their best. His death meant more than the loss of a leader. It meant that the Empire's understanding of humanity had been catastrophically flawed. One of the advisors stood, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Your Excellency, we must consider the possibility that these humans possess superweapons." The room tensed. The thought was ludicrous. Humanity's technological advancements had been decades, if not centuries, behind the leading species of the galaxy. But what if they had something undisclosed? The Shi'ari hadn't just been defeated, they had been crushed too, quickly. Their fleet had vanished in hours. Their homeworld obliterated in a single strike. The Emperor exhaled slowly. "Have we intercepted any intelligence that would confirm such a possibility?" The intelligence officer swallowed hard. "There have been rumors. The humans call it Project Fubar." The room went still. "What does it do?" the Emperor asked. The intelligence officer hesitated. "We don't know." The Emperor narrowed his eyes. "You don't know. No records exist. No intercepted transmissions. Only speculation. But whatever it is, the humans keep it classified at the highest level. Even their own military command doesn't discuss it openly. A slow dread crept over the assembled leaders. The only thing more terrifying than an enemy wielding a superweapon was an enemy who refused to acknowledge its existence. The Emperor steepled his fingers. We need leverage. We need to force them to reveal their hand before we commit further fleets to war. What do you propose? A formal demand for negotiations. The room erupted in protest. Your Excellency, if we negotiate now, it will make us look weak. We are weak, the Emperor countered. At least until we understand what we're dealing with. Humanity does not behave as the other species do. They do not act in predictable patterns. And right now, every species in the galaxy is watching to see if we falter. He turned to his aides, summoned their leader. Summon Alexander Grayson. I want to see the human who started this. The Galactic Empire's request for a diplomatic summit was met with immediate acceptance. It was the first tactical error they had made. Alexander Grayson stood on the bridge of the TNS Retribution, one of Earth's new flagship warships, and smiled as he read the transmission. He knew exactly why the Empire had asked for negotiations. Fear. The Empire had no idea what they were up against, and the lack of information was paralyzing them. Grayson had spent years as a diplomat. He knew how governments functioned. He knew how paranoia spread in high command, and he knew how to exploit it. He turned to Admiral Felix, a hardened veteran whose grin mirrored his own. They think we have a superweapon. Felix chuckled. Do we? Grayson took a slow sip of his coffee. Not even remotely. Felix's grin widened. Then let's make them think we do. The negotiations were held on neutral ground, an artificial moon serving as an unaligned diplomatic station. The Imperial delegation arrived first, their fleet hanging ominously in the void. But when the human delegation arrived, the Empire's confidence wavered. Human warships, hundreds of them, too many for a species that was supposed to be technologically inferior. And more troublingly, they did not match any previously recorded Terran ship classes. These were new ships, ships that had never been seen before, ships the Empire had never accounted for in their intelligence reports. The Emperor sat at the negotiating table, keeping his composure. Across from him, Alexander Grayson lowered himself into his seat with practiced ease, adjusting his cuffs, as if he were settling in for an afternoon meeting instead of an intergalactic showdown. Let's get to the point, the Emperor began. We wish to discuss terms for an end to hostilities. Grayson nodded, setting down a data tablet. Good. You should. The Emperor's expression darkened. Do not mistake this as surrender, human. Grayson smiled. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. The Emperor hesitated. Grayson was too calm, too confident. It was unnerving. The Empire, the Emperor continued, will agree to withdraw all remaining forces from contested territories. In return, humanity must disclose the details of Project Fubar. Grayson exhaled, tilting his head. Ah, that. The Emperor narrowed his eyes. Grayson leaned forward. Do you really want to know what Project Fubar is? The room seemed to tighten. Every Imperial delegate leaned in, holding their breath. Grayson gave a slow, knowing smile. Then he stood, tapped a command into his wrist communicator, and gestured to the observation window behind them. A massive orbital station outside the moon came to life. The Empire's military advisors tensed. The station was activating. Something was powering up. The next moment, a massive energy burst fired from the station, aimed directly at Earth. The Emperor shot up from his seat, panic flashing in his eyes. What have you done? Grayson simply watched. Seconds passed. The energy burst reached Earth's atmosphere. Then it scattered harmlessly. Nothing happened. The Emperor was about to demand an explanation when his advisors began receiving frantic reports. Earth's entire civilian population was cheering. Then came the realization. Grayson turned back to them, grinning. Project Fubar isn't a superweapon. He pointed to the energy burst's impact zone. It's the galaxy's largest orbital microwave. We just made the biggest bowl of popcorn in human history. The Empire's delegation sat in stunned, absolute silence. Grayson took a slow sip of his coffee. And the best part? He gestured at the Imperial delegation's horrified expressions. You just assumed we were playing fair this entire time. The negotiations lasted 4 more minutes before the Empire surrendered. The war was over. The Galactic Empire, once the undisputed ruler of the stars, had surrendered. Not in a grand, drawn-out battle. Not in a noble duel between evenly matched foes. They had surrendered because they had been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and outplayed at every turn. They had bowed not to overwhelming firepower, but to the pure, unfiltered audacity of humanity. It was a truth that would be whispered across the galaxy for generations. The mighty Empire, the oldest and most feared civilization in the known universe, had fallen not to an ancient rival, not to some long-lost conqueror, but to humans. The upstarts. The newcomers. The species that no one had taken seriously until it was too late. In the halls of power, in the crumbling remains of once great dominions, alien leaders met in hushed terror, trying to understand. They reviewed battle footage, analyzed tactical reports, dissected every encounter with a kind of desperate fervor usually reserved for doomsday scenarios. But no matter how much they examined, no matter how many theories they crafted, one thing remained abundantly clear. The humans had won because they refused to play the game by anyone else's rules. On Earth, celebrations erupted in every city, on every continent. The war had been shorter than anyone had expected, but its consequences would echo for centuries. Entire generations would grow up knowing that their people had done the impossible. They had toppled the greatest empire in galactic history, and they had done it with a mixture of sheer ingenuity, reckless tenacity, and an almost pathological refusal to accept reality as it was presented to them. But for Alexander Grayson, the victory felt hollow. He stood alone on the balcony of a diplomatic estate, high above the Terran capital, watching the revelers below. Fireworks exploded in the distance, illuminating the night sky in dazzling colors. People cheered. Cities roared with triumph. Yet all he could think about was his family. He closed his eyes, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. He had won. He had avenged them. He had taken an entire empire and burned it to the ground with nothing but his words, his wit, and the unrelenting will of humanity. And yet, none of it could bring them back. He took a slow breath, gripping the balcony railing. It was over now. The war had been fought. The battle had been won. And yet, what came next? The answer arrived sooner than he expected. A voice spoke behind him, breaking the silence. You should be celebrating. He turned. President Evelyn Hathaway stood in the doorway, hands in the pockets of her coat, watching him with that sharp, knowing gaze of hers. Grayson exhaled through his nose. I think we've celebrated enough. Hathaway stepped forward, leaning against the railing beside him. The galaxy is terrified of us. They should be. She smirked. They think we have superweapons. Grayson let out a short laugh. And we let them think that. Hathaway nodded. But fear is a tricky thing. It doesn't just keep enemies away. It breeds paranoia. We've won, but now the real challenge begins. He knew what she was getting at. The galaxy wouldn't trust humans now. They wouldn't see them as allies. They would see them as something worse. Something unpredictable. Something dangerous. For all the Empire's sins, its rule had been stable. Humanity had just torn that stability apart. Grayson sighed. So what happens now? Hathaway looked at him, and for the first time, she looked almost hesitant. We lead. Grayson scoffed. We just spent the last few weeks proving that we're the biggest bunch of lunatics in the galaxy. Who in their right mind would follow us? Hathaway shrugged. Doesn't really matter, does it? We're in charge now. And there it was. The truth laid bare. Humanity had never wanted this war, but they had won it. They had never sought power, but now they held it. And with that power came responsibility, whether they wanted it or not. Grayson exhaled. So what? We become the new empire? Hathaway shook her head. No. We become something better. There was a weight in her words, a certainty that he recognized. Humanity would not rule as the Empire had ruled. They would not conquer as the Empire had conquered. They would not oppress as the Empire had oppressed. But they would not be weak. Not ever again. A chime sounded from Hathaway's communicator. She checked it, frowned, then handed it to Grayson. "You're going to want to see this." He took it, scanning the message. His brow furrowed. "The Empire's remaining leaders are requesting an audience." "They're desperate," Hathaway said. "They don't know what to do without the old hierarchy. They're terrified we'll wipe them out." Grayson stared at the message for a long moment. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He had fought for vengeance. He had fought to make them pay. And yet, standing here now, he realized something. Vengeance had been only the beginning. The war was over. But humanity's true rise had just begun. He handed the communicator back to Hathaway, straightened his jacket, and turned toward the doorway. "Let's see what they have to say." Hathaway smiled. "That's the spirit." And with that, Alexander Grayson, the man who had shattered an empire with 7 words, stepped forward to face the future.